Right, okay, good. I can hear myself. Right, what I'm going to do is talk about resentment and how through childhood trauma, when we begin to do the work and we're no longer disassociating, what happens is that we begin to wake up inside. And it's a very long road dealing with complex PTSD. There are no quick fixes. And what I found myself a couple of years ago, 2017 November, I got this book, which is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, Pete Walker. And as a result of this book, I began the long process of understanding what was going on in my life through years and years of quite a lot of hardship and early trauma. And I was thinking about resentment the last 24 hours, because it can be quite insidious, because it's almost like when we've been through abuse, what can happen is that when we begin to awaken and we feel all of these emotions, and where we really get to see the truth of what happened to us and how much we've suffered and how little nurture and love we've had in childhood, a lot of resentment can begin to bubble to the surface. So what a lot of people did say to me over the years, which was really difficult for me to hear, and I'm somewhat still ambivalent about it, depending on the cases of what one thinks about the word, but forgiveness. A lot of people in society will tell us that no matter how heinous you were treated by your parents, that the idea is that you just forgive like a light switch, and you turn it on this, or turn it off, turn it on, and you're healed and all of your problems have gone away, and it's for your own good. And that's not really helpful in cases of deep trauma, where there's been sexual abuse or a loss, abandonment and betrayal, and where there's been parents that clearly wasn't good enough parenting. But again, there's the idea that the deeper we go into understanding what goes on, that we can see that people that abuse generally came from abuse, and they've got a lot of, stuff going on in themselves, and they just don't know, they're not that conscious, that they don't know how to behave. So forgiveness is a funny one in my mind, because I do believe that when we get to the point of we've processed a lot of our own inner pain, we can get to a place where we're more at ease in ourselves. So it's not, the word forgiveness is, going to be different for everybody. Resentment is a complex issue. It's multi-layered emotions, and it's a mix of disappointment, anger, and fear. So resentment can be where there's a lot of anger inside of us, and where there's a lot of fear inside of us, that we don't want to face the people that, hurt us, that we can't deal with that. And resentment is triggered by emotionally disturbing experiences. So when we feel resentful, generally resentment just doesn't come out of nowhere. Something has happened to us that has caused us to feel resentment. And there's a difference between being resentful for not getting your prom dress, for instance, and being sexually abused for years or violated as a child. It's completely different, clearly. So there are different types of resentment, and what happens is that we can feel this. I'm looking at my notes here. So we can feel this at different times, and it's basically because there's been an insult or there's been an injury. So when we feel resentment, it can be to do with insult or injury. And as we move through life and we do our healing, we will get to a point where we'll be able to see what's going on and be able to heal those deeper layers of ourselves. But it is from childhood, generally, deep held resentment from childhood rather, is very difficult to process, and it takes us being adults, because we have to have our left brain active to understand what went on. When we're very small, we're only right brain, we're not thinking logically, so we don't understand. And when we start having flashbacks and lots of memories, the resentment can begin to really be heightened in us, and it can begin to spoil our day-to-day life and activity. And there's nothing wrong with feeling resentful for a period of time. And also in the book, Pete Walker, From Surviving to Thriving, Complex PTSD, he talks about healthy anger and healthy blame, because we can't just band-aid, trauma, and it will come up. It comes up in nightmares, it comes up in social anxiety, panic attacks, and then disassociation. Gabor Mate, who's a brilliant guy to follow or look at on YouTube, talks about, you know, with addictions, and addictions are not just alcohol and drugs, addictions are food, shopping, you know, internet usage, all sorts of addictions where we're hypervigilant and we, you know, we're in fight, flight, freeze forms. So we will either switch ourselves off, or we'll be in a place where we're causing ourselves a lot of problems by not getting our lives sorted out, if this is making sense. But basically resentment is because we've been treated unfairly, and it's where there's been injustice and where there's been wrongdoing. And when we see things in society, it's very difficult for people who've been through, you know, people who've been through trafficking and people who've had sexual abuse, with the current case of the Epstein case. And then in the UK, we have Prince Andrew, who's had to step down from his duties because he was hanging out with Epstein, who was a paedophile, a known paedophile. And then we see pictures of, you know, a president also with, you know, his arm hanging out with a paedophile, around a paedophile, hanging out with a paedophile. When we have this at the top in society where there is power and an abuse of power, then it affects the people, that the millions and millions and millions who have been through abuse, who are watching that stuff, are going to be triggered. And that can bring up more resentment that, you know, there are people in power that are getting away with these things. But ultimately, we've got to deal with our day-to-day life and our day-to-day reality. So also we can be triggered. There can be, you know, the resentment is caused through humiliation, discrimination, prejudice, and where we've been taken advantage of, and where we've not been recognized. So where our wounding has been ignored and it's not been recognized. I will add, actually, sorry that my Wi-Fi is a bit low, not low, but I'm using my mobile phone Wi-Fi. So what I've got is chat is not working. So I do apologize for that, but it will be from Monday. So what else? So we can then go on. I'm going to read a bit more from my notes. So there are 5 steps. When we're feeling resentment, basically the best way around it is to not beat ourselves up for feeling resentful, because if we're going to punish ourselves for feeling resentful, then we're just going to, you know, compound the problem. The best thing to do is acknowledge that we feel resentment and know that it's something that we're working on and that there's nothing wrong with it, and acceptance that you're having the emotion of feeling resentment and the reasons why you feel resentment as well. And in acknowledgement of it and acceptance of it, then we begin to evolve it. And it's not something, again, it's not a light switch we just turn on and off. Then we can also look at what action is required, if any, to stop us feeling resentful. And sometimes that's going to be facing up to somebody or something, or it's going to mean making certain changes in our own lives, whether that's stopping integrating with certain people and such like. And then also realizing that where we do have power, so we need to look at where we do now have power in our lives, because it's quite easy to keep playing back over our childhood and get even more resentful. But we need to purge our resentment as well. It's important to know that we can purge our resentment. And then we can get to, at some point, you know, and we can do this in our healing, is like having the gratitude and self-love, which is really important, and doing our inner critic work, which Pete Walker says in his book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. You can get a copy of that book. The link is below. You can get it free on Audible USA, and you can get it free on Kindle UK from Amazon. So just check that out and do get the book, because it's going to begin to help you if you've got complex PTSD, which is not a disorder, it's a response to events. Then we can also begin to look at our beliefs and acceptance of what we're feeling and the situation we're in. Also to know that healing, any trauma is not linear, it's non-linear. So it means that we, you know, there's no sort of proper route to it, but the best way is to begin with the inner critic. And below the video as well, you're going to find 14 steps for managing flashbacks, 14 steps for managing your inner critic, which is the thing that we need to do first to begin our healing process. And then 13 steps for managing flashbacks, to understand what you're doing with your triggers. Something I did last night, I'm going to show you this book here. This is called You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. And this came out in 1984. In 1984, I was 18 years old. And for some reason, I bought this book. And last night, I noticed that I had it also on my Audible. And what I suggest is that this is a great book to also have. It's a bit difficult on the forgiveness thing, this book. She does go on a lot about forgiveness, but to me that, you know, in heinous abuse, forgiveness is not the first thing. The first thing is going to be the inner critic and self-love. And on Audible, that book is 4.5 hours in total. So you could listen to that in an afternoon. And I suggest that you could listen to that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. It's like to implement understanding how our thoughts, you know, and changing the way we think begins to help us to evolve into getting the lives we want. And the reason is, and excuse my French here, but if we're going around pissed off all of the time because we've been abused, and it's so easy to get to that point where it's really painful because we've had loss, abandonment and betrayal, and it's hard to know who to trust. It's hard to know, you know, or to feel safe in the world. It can, you know, it's almost like the trauma causes even deep further trauma in us, and we then don't, you know, and then we miss out on life, which is really, really difficult. And I've seen myself over the years where I disassociated for years. A lot of us actually, and you know, not everybody, but in my 30s I was partying and I was doing recreational drugs and drinking. I didn't start until I was 30 doing that stuff, but the thing was that, you know, there comes a point you can sort of do that stuff in your 30s or whenever you're doing it in your 20s. But when you get into your 40s and 50s, you don't want to be, you know, disassociating. You want to get to the root of the problem and begin to heal it. I'm not suggesting that recreational drugs, you know, was you know, it wasn't particularly a good thing for me. It just kept, you know, it was all it was doing was helping me disassociate from the pain I was in. And that's what I was thinking with Gabor Mate, that he says with any addiction, that what we've really got is you know, not why the drugs or why the addiction, but why the pain. Because any addiction that we have, be it, you know, alcohol, drugs, sex, food, you know, shopping, whatever it is, there's some pain there that we're trying to alleviate. So it's really beautiful that he came to that conclusion that it's not why the drug or why the addiction, but why the pain. And when we begin to deal with our pain, then anything that we have been using to disassociate begins to drop off, because we're dealing with the real problem. And life, you know, is not meant to be lived in a haze of disassociation. So I hope that's useful to anybody out there. And if you've got any messages, you can find me over on Facebook. I've got my links below. You can find me on Facebook, and I'll be doing more videos on this. But again, the 2 books that I'm suggesting to you, the one you can get below for free in my link below, this one, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And then Louise Hay, who some may or may not know, she passed away, I think it was maybe 2 years ago now, I can't recall. But she, this is a great book. It's got some really useful tips in there. Okay, that's it for today. I'll be back in a couple of days. Thanks for watching.